My name is Gale du Pont, and in this video, we will talk about being a trauma-informed church for those experiencing domestic violence. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner, and many more have experienced verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse and stalking. But it's important to recognize that domestic violence happens to all people, all generations, in both heterosexual and LGBTQIA2S+ relationships. Considering the frequency with which domestic violence occurs, it is likely that we have members sitting in our church pews who are currently experiencing or have experienced domestic violence, and we don't even realize it. The hallmark of traumatic experience is that it typically overwhelms an individual mentally, physically, and emotionally, and is characterized by feelings of intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, and the feeling of impending death. Joni Sankin, in her book, Words That Heal, Preaching Hope to Wounded Souls, uses the term soul wound, which she describes as pain that lingers within those who survive trauma and other wounding experiences. The trauma of domestic violence can lead to many physical conditions, such as neurological disorders, chronic pain and disability, hypertension and cardiovascular disease, and cancer. And the mental health effects include depression and anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and even suicidal behavior. Traumatic events produce profound and lasting changes in the physiological arousal, emotion, cognition, and memory. A trauma-informed approach is based on the recognition that many behaviors and responses experienced and expressed by survivors are directly related to their traumatic experiences. Trauma-informed care views services in the case of the church, whether it be worship, faith formation, pastoral care, and all other things we do as the church, through the lens of trauma. Trauma-informed in the context of the church means to shine the healing light of Christ on traumatic and other wounds. The services that the church provides need to be designed to acknowledge the impact of domestic violence and trauma on people's lives. A trauma-informed approach is sensitive and respectful, seeks to respond to traumatized individuals with supportive intent, which consciously avoids re-traumatizing them. Trauma-informed care shifts the philosophical approach from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. In communities of faith, abuse often stems from toxic theology that asserts male power, dominance, authority over women. The church has often believed the falsified stories of male abusers over the lived experiences of women. Trauma survivors who have sought help from the church have heard words like, divorce is a sin, submit in your marriage, you made your bed, now lie in it, and try couples counseling. Many voices who have not been heard have left the church, questioning God, expressing anger at God, and even blaming God. So how do we become a trauma-informed church? Well, first, we need to have a basic understanding of trauma and trauma-informed care and how trauma impacts people's lives, including their behavior and cognition. There are many programs available for training in trauma-informed care, and I encourage all pastors and lay leaders, and even individual members of the congregation, to learn as much as you can. Also learn about domestic violence, the causes, the effects, and be able to recognize the signs, which include frequent injuries with self-blaming excuses like, I'm so clumsy, visible marks, clothing out of season to cover bruises, unsettled demeanor such as agitation or flinching when someone approaches you or in a response to loud noises, depression, often referring to the abuser to answer questions, and isolation. One of the most important things we need to do is to believe and validate. This allows the person to feel loved and protected and give them the ability to open up about what is happening to them. We need to recognize the triggers or events or situations that in some way resemble past trauma, making it difficult for survivors to stay grounded in the present. Triggers represent danger, and they can be sights or sounds, smells, objects, life events, and can lead to behaviors such as agitation, fearfulness, along with physical symptoms such as headaches, increased heart rate, and blood pressure that causes the individual to go into a flight mode and flee the situation. We need to establish safe, not perfect spaces. False beliefs and imperfect community can result in survivors not sharing their stories for fear of being imperfect in a perfect space. We need to learn how to listen and speak, because language is very important when interacting with trauma survivors. Provide a non-judgmental listening ear without providing feedback, and avoid the urge to jump in and solve the problem. And most importantly, do not blame the survivor. Frame questions without judgment, focusing on open-ended questions that encourage survivors to describe events in their own words, on their own terms, and at their own pace. We need to understand that trauma changes the brain, so give survivors permission to not remember everything. Certain memories may not be recalled until confronted with a trigger. Many who have been in abusive relationships do not recognize their experience as trauma, because being in a constant state of stress can numb one to the dangers around them. We need to remember that thoughts and prayers alone just don't cut it, and learn to help support survivors by helping them to establish a safety plan, whatever it may look like for them. We need to realize that there are many fears and social constructs that keep individuals in abusive relationships, and so we cannot blame them if they wish to stay. We also need to be familiar with community resources for emergency housing and shelters and counseling through our local domestic violence services. I mentioned before that language is very important when interacting with those experiencing domestic violence. And what has more impact with language than our scripture readings and our sermons? Pay attention to potential violence and trauma in the text when crafting a sermon, because you may not know who is sitting in your audience. There are many troubling texts in the Bible that speak to violence, and many have been used to condone and perpetuate violence, leading those experiencing abuse to remain in the abusive relationship. Utilize trauma-aware exegesis, which leads to trauma-sensitive preaching. Name what is troubling in and around the text. Describe the structure and movement and plot, and apply trauma-sensitive interpretive tools. You may want to consider a disclaimer or warning at the start of scripture readings that contain violence. And when addressing brokenness, allow the gospel to counterbalance those wounding experiences by focusing on the good news, hope, and promises of Jesus. Always end the sermon with hope. And finally, find ways that in all the church does to counter the pervasiveness of toxic theology that subjugates people to abuse by speaking out against domestic violence, empowering those facing abuse to break the cycle of silence and violence. The goal of trauma-informed care is to help survivors develop resilience, the ability to bounce back and reconfigure their lives, the ability to change and rebuild one's life after trauma. This will allow survivors to recover, to grow, to learn to trust again, to focus on their strengths and to heal. When the church uses trauma-informed practices, The toxicity of patriarchal theology can be unlearned. The survivors' holistic care can be prioritized, and the policies that pursue accountability and justice can be established. Survivors can then thrive in safe spaces and access healing through intentional love and consistent support from communities of faith. So let us model Christ's love by prioritizing survivors in our communities of faith.